Okay, so I think I told you all in our class meeting last week that in order to get the full 3 hours of instruction, um, because we're only meeting in this classroom, you and I are only meeting together for an hour and a half, right? That I would record the Thursday class session. I have another hybrid class, Jeff Texas hybrid class that meets at the same time slot in the same room on Thursday, okay? So I'm recording their class sessions for you as the second part of the week's material, and I'm recording your class sessions for them. That's why I have set up this collaborate session. Um, it's really, nothing really for you to worry about. I'm just trying to give you an explanation of, what's going on here. At any rate, what does matter for you is, well, let me put it to you in the form of a question. How many of you um, did the part that you were supposed to last week for the Thursday, the equivalent of the Thursday class session, which was go out and view the recording for last week? That hour and a half session. Okay, one person, two people, okay, more and more people are raising hands. That's good news to me because I really don't intend to come in here on Tuesdays and re-lecture what was covered in that material. Okay, I mean you just have to understand you signed up for a hybrid class, and so you have to do your part, which is the other hour and a half of instruction. Okay, now I am willing to entertain whatever questions that you might have from that recording. Okay, so when you watch that recording, just pretend you're sitting in the class session. It is a recording of a live class session. And we're covering the same material in there that we would have covered if we had a Thursday class session last week. Okay, so those of you who did watch it, remember you're going to take a lecture quiz next Tuesday when you come in, and that material, not only the material that we cover in class today, okay, but the material that was put out there for you last week, okay? And then the Thursday class session that will be recorded for you this week. That's all subject to quizzing on that first lecture quiz. So you want to make sure that you do that. It's going to be hard to do well in the lecture quizzes if you don't do this part. But like anything else, it's just like in a face-to-face class that meets twice a week. If you only come on Tuesdays, you're going to be missing out on a lot of material, right? If you only come to class on Thursdays, you're going to be missing out on a lot of material.
So are the live class sessions always going to be there? Are they going to be taken?
No, I take them down every week, right? So part of that is motivated by restrictions on storage space. With like video files require a lot of storage space. So part of it is motivated by that, but it's also just a philosophical motivation because I think that learning takes place best in a week-to-week structured environment. And if we just kind of leave things out there for people to do at their leisure, it doesn't work well, particularly given the fact that we're taking quizzes every day. See, like if I left that out there indefinitely for you to get to, and you say, oh, I'll get to it in week 5, that's when I'm going to finally have the time. Oh, no, it really won't do you good. It'll do you good in terms of learning, but it won't do you any good in terms of the lecture quiz because you will have already been quizzed over that. I mean, the part of the discipline, I think, that is, kind of enforced in this regard is that we're taking those quizzes every 2 weeks over lecture material. So you don't want to let it go. Just, think about this class as really a face-to-face class, but you're doing one of the class sessions online at your convenience before the end of the week. Okay? And I hope that is, I know it's not an ideal, for some people that's not ideal, but like I said, the course, in order for it to satisfy the 3-hour requirement, I think I mentioned this to you all in class last Tuesday, right? In order to satisfy that 3-hour requirement, we have to get another hour and a half of instruction in.
So like if we were to be taken down, in order to remember that session, you just have to take really good notes.
Well, just like you would in a regular class session, right? You can't hit pause in a live class session. You can't pause and rewind, right? Or you can't come back 2 days later and hit rewind on a live class session, right? You either are present, and I mean mentally present, not just physically present. You're either present during that class session and engaged, and I strongly encourage taking good notes to study from, whether it's in the Tuesday class session when we're in here together in the classroom, or whether it's in the Thursday, quote unquote, Thursday class session that you're getting online. Pretend you're just in class and you're taking notes. you do have the convenience of pausing there that you wouldn't have. But like I said, if it was a Tuesday, Thursday face-to-face class session, you wouldn't be able to, rewind a week and go back and look at that material again. Anything else? Good questions. Anything else? I know it has been a week since we've met, and so I told you one of the things that we could do in today's class session at the beginning before we jump into new material is field questions. If you have them, hopefully everybody has taken the opportunity to read through all those documents in the course document section. I had a couple of questions before we actually officially started the class session about the discussion boards. Remember, those start next week, and you should know which ones you're assigned to. If you're assigned to week 3, then you're up first, right? You're leadoff hitter. You're one of the leadoff hitters, right? But some of you won't go in week 3, and some of you may not go until week 7 or something like that, right? You need to look at that document, weekly discussion boards, or schedule of due dates. There's 2 different documents where you can find this information. Scroll down to where you find the discussion board schedule and find your name. Make sure your name is listed there 4 times. Okay, I tried to do that, accurately, but I have to be honest with you, that's one of the tasks related to my job that is I'm prone to error on. Okay, because it's a lot of like copying and pasting and detailed sort of things that it's easy for me to only list someone 3 times, right, or list somebody 5 times or something like that. So just go through that document if you want, print it out, highlight your name, make sure it's there 4 times. And if it's not there 4 times, if it's some other amount, either greater or lesser, please shoot me a message so that I can fix it. Anything else you want to ask about before we jump into a discussion of material? Well, okay, if you have nothing else that you want to ask, it's not your last chance to ask a question about the general parameters of this course. It's just the last time we're going to take a chunk of class time to do that. So if something occurs to you, get with me individually and I'll try to give you an answer. Okay, we're just going to jump to a discussion of material. And as I said, I'm not going to cover the same material that I did in that recorded class session, but I will entertain any questions that you have them, if you have them. And just to refresh your memory, what we dealt with in that recorded class session were the definitions of politics and government, right? And I actually gave you 3 different definitions of politics. One's not good enough. I got to give you 3, okay? They all say the same thing, essentially, right? Any questions about that definition of politics and why it's important to have a good value neutral definition of politics? You understand what I mean by a value neutral definition of politics? So I can't remember if I told this little story in that recorded session, but let me just, for those of you who've watched it, if it was there, it'll be a reminder. If not, it'll be new. I had a student in a class session years ago who, kind of started off the class session, rather than just giving them a definition of politics, I asked them to write down definitions of politics. And then they sort of passed it in, and I went through them. And one of them said, politics is corruption. And I said, who wrote that? And she raised her hand. I did. Right? And I said, well, what do you mean politics is corruption? She looked at me. She had the most astonished look on her face, like, well, of course it is. Aren't you supposed to know that? Like, aren't you a political scientist? Aren't you supposed to know that? And, I tried to get her to, I tried to press her a little bit to get her to explain, but she really couldn't say anything beyond that. She said, it's just really obvious. And I said, well, that's naive. And, I don't think she liked that too much, but, she kind of pressed me. Well, what do you mean it's naive? And I said, well, it's naive to define politics as corruption. Don't you know better? Aren't you supposed to? And I said, of course there is corruption in politics. Right? I would be naive. I would be foolish if I didn't I would be remiss in my duties as a political science, instructing this class, to not concede that there's corruption in politics, but there's corruption in a lot of other human processes and institutions as well. As I like to say, there's corruption in politics, sure, but there's also corruption in religion, and there's corruption in education, and there's corruption in athletics, and there's corruption in business, there's corruption in marriage. Anything that human beings lay their hands on is susceptible to corruption. And so why should politics be any different? But if we define politics as she did, politics is corruption, we are saying that they are the same thing. Like a mathematical expression, right? Simple arithmetic expression. 2 + 2 is 4. They're the same thing. Well, politics and corruption are not the same thing. Admittedly, there is corruption in politics, but we have to have a more value-neutral definition or a more value-neutral understanding. And I hope that these definitions really serve that purpose. I don't think there's really any fair or accurate accusation that can be made that that there's something about these definitions that suggest an agenda. Well, again, from the recorded lecture from last week, I told you that all three definitions really say the same thing. It's just that the Lasswell definition and the Easton definitions we can only kind of infer some important things from them. This definition that I'm offering you says explicitly what you can only infer from the Lasswell and Easton's definition, and that is that politics is a competitive process. And that's the point that I was trying to really drive home about, whether we like it or not, we just have to accept the fact that there are going to be winners and losers in politics. Because, why is it competitive? Well, because the things that we value as a society are characterized by scarcity. We can't all have as much wealth as we want. We can't all have as much education we want. We can't all have as much clean air as we want. Whatever the valued thing is that goes on this list of valued things that Easton is suggesting to us, and we could put it together a pretty long list, but I think it's easier just to start with wealth and kind of focus on that, right? We can't all have as much wealth as we want, when we want it, how we want it. So society has to develop some process for determining who gets it, when they get it, and how they get it. And we just call that process politics. And if you're thinking, well, why does it have to be that way? Why can't everybody just have as much wealth as they want to, when they want it, how they? The answer is because of scarcity. So when we all die and go to heaven, there will be no want, no need, right? No politics, no allocation of scarce resources. But in human society, earthly human society, we can't avoid politics. Now that politics may be more amenable, it may be more to our liking or less to our liking, depending on what society we live in. And we can get into that a little bit here in just a minute, okay? But the bottom line is that we can't avoid politics. Okay, so any questions about that sort of bottom line point in the discussion of politics? It's an inescapable thing. Why? Because the things that we value in our society, we're in competition over them. And then we moved to the discussion of government. And again, I'm not going to go back through all this again. Okay, I just gave you one definition of government there. Okay, after some discussion of what legitimacy is, why legitimacy is important as a concept, why it's so relevant, the related discussion about popular sovereignty and consent of the governed. That should all ring a bell for you if you watch those videos. Quick show of hands. How many of you remember that? Okay, good. All right, so the definition that we came away with of government, and again, value neutral. I do understand, I've done this gig for a long time, okay? And I do understand that sometimes I have students, not all my students, or maybe not even most of them, but I definitely have some students who come into the class with some baggage, some emotional baggage about government and their preconceived notions about what it is or what it isn't. And, we got to, at least for the purposes of this course, divorce ourselves of that baggage dismiss it from our minds, if possible, for a value neutral definition of government. And this is the one that I think serves our purposes the best. There are all kinds of different definitions of government out there, including by authors of textbooks. This, for example, is not the definition of government, the same definition of government that the authors of your textbook give you. I do want you to be aware that there are lots of concepts that we're dealing with this semester in this course where the authors of your textbook may define it or discuss it in these terms, and then I define it or discuss it in some different terms. I'm not telling you they're right, they're wrong, and I'm right, or even that I'm right and they're wrong. Well, that's closer to the truth. I'm just telling you that it's a different way of defining it. It's a different way of looking at it. And I like this definition because, you know, it tells us a couple of things that I think we should know. First of all, what do I mean by structured arrangements? Who remembers from the video, from the recorded lecture? What is this recorded arrangements intended to suggest to you? Structured arrangements. I just mean it's not random, right? Government has some structure, it has some form to it. In fact, in the American system, this is, of course, in Texas government, but you all understand that Texas is part of the American system, right? In the American system, it is extremely, it has been, at least up to this point in our experience, a high emphasis on form and structure. The Americans who founded the Republic in 1776, but particularly a few years later when they wrote the Constitution in 1787, they were very attentive to form and structure. This was for those of you who have interest in other areas, I'll just remind you that this was the classical era. Okay? You know anything about classical music or classical architecture or art or some of these other pursuits? The attention during the classical era was all to form and structure. And so it was no different for people like Madison and Franklin and Adams and Hamilton and so on. They were very attentive to the structures and forms of government that they were creating under the Constitution. But more, just to be a little bit less American specific, what I'm really trying to tell you is that government generally has some form and structure, although it may be to a greater or lesser degree. If you can imagine, for example, a society governed by warlords, right, where you have some local elite who has a cadre of people around him, heavily armed people around him who are very loyal, and they enforce the local rules and the laws and the customs, and they maybe even provide some services and so on. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Like how that might exist, right? That would be on a scale of formal, relative scale of form. That would be much less formal than the American system, but it's still government. But under either circumstance or anything in between, it's not random. Okay? Produces and enforces decisions resolving conflicts over scarce resources. So there you see the connection between the definition of government and the definition of politics, right? In fact, really what I'm trying to tell you here is that government is the mechanism by which society allocates its scarce resource. The politics is the process of determining who gets the scarce resources, when they get them, and how they get them. But the how is, at least for our purposes, very often going to lead us to a consideration of government. Even though economic goods in our society, and again in the American system of which Texas is a part, most economic goods are allocated through a private marketplace, right? Through a pricing mechanism, right? But at a minimum, even the most free market economists, right? The most libertarian economists will tell you that you have to have a government, even if for no other reason than to enforce contracts. The minimum, you're going to at least have to have a court system to enforce contracts, but probably a police force, an executive function of government as well, in order to enforce those contracts. Okay, so we're not saying that every resource, everything of value in our society, every scarce resource is directly allocated by government. But at a minimum, government sets the parameters, the rules of the game, so to speak, for that allocation of scarce resources. Like, I mentioned in the lecture, the recorded lecture, if you think about somebody I think I covered this in that recording. If you think about a name that all of us would recognize, somebody of great personal wealth, right? Somebody throw a name out there that we'd all recognize, somebody fabulously wealthy. Who? Jeff Bezos is a good one. Anybody else want to give us someone?
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk. Okay. Not that many years ago, the name would have been Bill Gates. Okay. Although he would still be on that list, right? He's not the richest man in the world anymore, but he's still up there pretty high, right? At any rate, the government didn't allocate $150 billion or whatever he's worth to Jeff Bezos. The government didn't enact a law and said Jeff Bezos is going to have $150, $160 billion. By the way, when we start talking about that kind of money, $160 billion, I don't even know if I think that's in the ballpark for Jeff Bezos, but I'm not sure how close it is.
I think it's 150 billion.
Yeah. So, people say things like $150 billion or $160 billion as if they're virtually synonymous. Well, give me the difference. I'll be quite happy. The difference between 150 billion and 160 billion. That's still a lot of money. If I asked you, okay, look, I've got an offer for you. You can't refuse. If I give you $1 million, will you be happy? You will not be happy?
I'll be happy.
But that's all you're going to get the rest of your life. If I told you for the rest of your life, that's it, $1 million. Now some of you are shaking your head no. So what if I change it? Okay, $1 million a year.
Yeah.
That's better. Yeah. But let me ask you this question, just as a thought experiment. How many years would it take you? How long would you have to live to get to Jeff Bezos' money?
Probably like over 200 years.
A little over 200 years. Yeah. Somebody do the arithmetic on that. Okay. 16,000 years. Yeah. That's the kind of money that I wish I could understand, but I just can't really get my brain around. Anyway, the government didn't say, Bezos, you're going to have $160 billion and, Elon Musk, you're going to have whatever he has, 120 billion, or he might actually be wealthier than Bezos now.
Yeah.
By the most recent accounting, he's even.
The stock for.
What is he? 224. 44.
Amazon stock just crashed a lot, so.
Yeah, I can't even begin to understand that. But, whoever it is that's at the top, the government didn't say you're going to have $244 billion. And Fagan, you're going to have, I won't tell you what I'm worth, okay, but it's not $160 billion. It doesn't work that way in our system. But, using Bill Gates as an example, mainly because I know a little bit more about his story than I do the other two, Bill Gates, at one point, if you go back far enough, he wrote computer code. Now, in partnership with a few other guys, that led to the creation of Microsoft. And whether his genius is in writing computer code or whether it is in marketing or muscling out his partners or whatever it is, Bill Gates, well, he had some talent and some ability. But as I always like to make this point, illustrate this point by saying, like, imagine that all other things being the same, Bill Gates was exactly the same person. He had exactly the same intellect, exactly the same talent, exactly the same abilities, etc. The only difference is instead of living and developing his ideas in the United States of America, he lived in the People's Republic of China in the 1970s. Would we know Bill Gates today as this person of great wealth and personal fortune? We wouldn't, right? Because he would have developed Microsoft and maybe sold a few copies, but everybody else would have just pirated it. Because certainly in those days, and to a large extent still today, the People's Republic of China does not protect copyright law. That's how he gained his fortune, is through the protections of copyright law. And copyright laws are enacted by government. So do you see how that directly relates to this point about government playing a role in allocating scarce resources. The fact that he lives in a political society or lived in a political society that places a premium on intellectual property rights generally, but including intellectual property rights, means that the government is going to enforce copyright law. And all that goes with that, like the accumulation of monopoly profit as a result. That's what a patent and a copyright really does, is it allows one person or one firm to earn monopoly profits for a period of time. Okay, questions about any of that? How about any of this stuff? I'm going to run through this real quick because we do need to move on. Any questions about these different labels for government? Yes.
When they put in their own copyright and they get to that type of status of monopoly, how long does that time period usually last for?
I think copyrights last for 22 years in the United States, if I remember correctly, but they can be renewed. Does anybody know better than I? Anybody here have ambition to be a lawyer, maybe a copyright lawyer, a patent attorney, or something like that? I think it's 22 years, but can be renewed maybe more than once. Have you ever wondered why songs like that are written by musicians or musical composers, at some point they become part of the public domain? It's because copyrights expire ultimately and they can't be renewed again, right? So at some point, whoever your favorite band is or musician is, at some point, someone's going to be able to play their music without having to pay royalties. Every years down the road, that somebody's going to be able to play the Beatles catalog without, paying royalties to the owner of the copyright. Those guys didn't own their own music, right? That was the lesson. That was one of the lessons that the Beatles taught all other musicians, is own your own music. So as fabulously wealthy as they became, it was largely from performances and record sales, not from the royalties from their music. You know who initially bought the Beatles catalog when it became available? It was initially owned by a corporation, but Michael Jackson purchased it. And that's a big part of his wealth. Okay, did I stall long enough for you to think of questions you want to ask about this? Any of these distinctions? All I'm really trying to suggest to you here is that, we have our definition of government, structured arrangements, etc. Okay, but the way that those arrangements are structured and the way that they play out, we can differentiate. Right, all governments are not the same, and so sometimes what we do is we simply put an adjective in front of the phrase system of government, democratic system of government, autocratic system of government, etc. And that's supposed to have very different connotations, right? So these are just the basic characteristics associated with each of these four types. There are other types. I just, had to just limited the discussion to four, mainly for purposes of illustration. Okay. So we want to move on to a discussion of public policy. I guess I was in the right spot already. Okay. And whoops, clicked on the wrong one. Maybe I can get all three open at the same time. That's not good. Oh, good night. Sign in to sync your data. What does that mean? So here's one time during the semester where what I would say in class, in the absence of the policy primer, is in perfect alignment with the reading material. In other words, I think I mentioned to you in the first class meeting that you're going to discover as we go through the semester that there are some differences between the way that I present a chunk of the curriculum versus the way that the authors of your textbook present the curriculum. Not that they're necessarily in conflict with one another, but just it's a little different way to approach it, right? But here's the one time during the semester when what I asked you to read perfectly aligns with what I would bring you in the form of lecture material. Why? Well, because I wrote it. It makes sense then that it is in alignment, right? So my intention here is, this might take us 2-3 weeks to get through if I didn't give you the policy primer. We might have to devote a couple of weeks of the semester just to getting through this material in public policy. But instead, what I can ask you to do is read the policy primer, which you did in preparation for today's reading quiz, and then we can just sort of hit the highlights, okay, with today's rest of today's class session. All right. So, I guess maybe there's a couple of ways that we can do this. Let me start by opening it up to any questions. Does anybody have any questions about any of the information in the public policy primer? Just to refresh your memory, quick show of hands if you read the policy primer. I know I asked you that a little bit earlier, but I forgot. Okay, good. Most of you are saying that you did. Okay, so just to refresh your memory, started with a discussion of the characteristics of public policy. In fact, I told you that there really are no adequate definitions of public policy out there that I'm aware of. Even though the authors of your textbook attempt the definition of public policy, I find it somewhat deficient. Okay. But I'm no better because I can't give you one. I can't give you a better one. Instead, what I do is go through 5 defining characteristics of public policy. Okay. Does anybody have a good enough recall or mastery of this portion that they can tell us what the first one is? Who remembers? I say I'm going to give you the first one. Okay. The first thing that I identify in the primer is that public policy consists of decisions and actions, right? That a decision alone does not make public policy. Now, who remembers, I see a couple of you nodding your head, who can explain for the benefit of the rest of the class, and who may not be as clear as you are, why this is so important to make this point about policy having 2 components, decisions and action. What's one possibility if we don't understand that policy consists of courses of action? In fact, I really should have said that. Policy consists of courses of action rather than mere decisions. Anything did you recall from that discussion?
Because government can say one thing, but it's not like they won't like actually do it.
Very good. Sometimes if I just wait long enough, someone will respond, right? Of course, the risk is that nobody ever answers and we just sit here and look at each other for a while. But thank you for chiming in on that, right? What she said was that sometimes government can decide to do something, or at least make a public announcement of that decision, but never follow up with any action, or that the action may be different, substantively different than what the government decides to do, or at least publicly says that it's going to do. Now, the question, I think in this course, I think probably in many courses that you take, the important questions are always the why questions, right? So why? Why is it possible that there could be this discrepancy between what government decides to do on the one hand versus what government actually does on the other hand, the course of action on the other hand?
Because it doesn't get approved, or there's different perspectives, so.
Do you remember a moment ago when we were talking about government, we said very formal and that there's a lot of attention to form in the American system? So we're going to think about this very formally. Okay, so if we talk about a decision, a government decision in a public policy context, we're taking the very formal understanding of that, which means that there has been some policy statement adopted. Okay, so remember that policy statements can take one of several forms. Let's see if this one works. Remember that a policy statement can take one of several forms. It can take the form of a statute. What's a statute? The statute is a legislative enactment. Statute law. It's a law passed by a legislative body. Give me an example of a legislative body. What's the national, what do we call our national legislature in the United States? We call it the United States Congress, right? And in the Constitution of the United States, there is a very formal process for Congress enacting a statute, which the basic components are that it has to be passed by a majority vote of the House of Representatives, in identical form, a majority vote by the United States Senate, and then it has to be sent to the president for signature. And if you don't get it in identical form by the House and Senate, or if the House and Senate do agree on identical form, but the president doesn't sign it, vetoes it, then a decision has not been made. Right? We're not, in the formal sense, a decision has not been made. A policy statement has not been adopted. A statute has not been enacted. The word is statute, not statute. Maybe you remember the old Seinfeld program. One of the great scenes is a debate between Jerry and Kramer about statute versus statute. Anyway, before your time. So simply an act passed by the legislature, an act of Congress. What is the legislative body at the state level here in Texas called? It's just the Texas legislature. Meets over in Austin, right? And at the local level, what do we call the legislative body? In a city, for example, what do we call the legislative body? Anybody know? This is something we're going to deal with in this course, but a what?
The person who's in charge of like the local is the mayor.
We're thinking about a body of people. Usually we're talking about more than one person, right? A body of elected representatives who make statute law for that jurisdiction. At the national level, that's the Congress that makes statute law for the jurisdiction called the United States of America. At the state level here in Texas, we have something called the Texas Legislature that meets under that dome over in Austin, right? That Capitol dome, right? That rotunda. It's called the Texas Legislature, and they make statute law for Texas, the statutes of the state of Texas. So the question is, at the local level, say the city, like the city of Sugar Land, what do we call the body that makes statute law or ordinances or that govern the city of Sugar Land? The city council. Usually there are some exceptions to that, but that's good enough for our purposes right now. The city council. And we don't call them statutes or acts really at the local level. We call them ordinances, but it's the same thing. Right? And then another form that a policy statement can take is an executive order. Now, unless you've been entirely comatose the last year, you are probably aware, regardless of what your source of information is, your source of news and information, you're probably aware that chief executive officers in American government, national, state level, have some ability to issue executive orders. The president, for example, has the authority to issue executive orders. And on some limited basis, the governor of Texas has the ability to issue executive orders. The question about the extent to which the Texas governor has that authority is one that is very much a subject for us in this course this semester when the appropriate time comes. I'll just give you a quick example. When the pandemic happened initially in March of 2020, and everything shut down, and the governor, who knows what the governor's name is? Greg Abbott. Governor Greg Abbott's response was to issue a series of executive orders under the authority given to the governor by an act of the Texas State Legislature, a statute passed by the Texas Legislature way back in 1975 called the Texas Disaster Act. Now, I have a feeling and pretty strong confidence in when I say this, that when the legislature passed that back in 1975, they probably weren't thinking about pandemics. They were probably thinking about hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, things like that. But that legislation provides that the governor can declare a disaster And once the governor declares that disaster, and only stays in place for a fixed period of time, but once the governor declares that disaster, then some executive authority attaches to the governor that would not exist otherwise, like the authority to issue executive orders. And initially for Governor Abbott, that involved things like ordering shutdowns of restaurants and other kinds of businesses and so on. But then he very quickly, sort of backed off that and started issuing executive order, because I think he believed it was working against his base of political support. He very quickly backed off that and started issuing executive orders that arguably work the other way, that there shall be no shutdowns, there shall be no mask requirements, there shall be no required immunizations or proof of vaccinations or anything like that. There's been a lot of that the governor's done over the course of this pandemic, right? And there's a lot of debate out there, both Democrats and Republicans, and legislators in particular, who want to rein that in, But all that, as I said, that's something for later on in the semester, right? I'm just trying to give you an example here of how that might work, where a chief executive officer, in this case, the governor of the state, may have some authority to issue policy statements. But let's just take this through to its conclusion, right? Let's say that the governor issues this executive order that says city, county government, school districts will not require masks. They cannot require people to wear masks. But Fort Bend County Judge KP George says, at least for a time, no, we're going to continue requiring masks. That's subsequently been dropped. But it's not that long ago, you may remember, right? Or some school districts around the state, the superintendents and the local board, they say, no, we're going to continue to have mask requirements. Like in some of the larger cities, that happened, right? So the point here about decisions and course of actions is that the governor may issue this executive order and say that the policy is that we will not require masks, but then in the school district, they keep requiring masks. Which is the policy? To require masks or not require masks? And on this particular issue, it may all have to be either flushed out by the courts. There have been already some court cases on that, right? But it may be that it'll just be resolved by the end of the pandemic, right? But you understand what I'm saying? Like, if in the Dallas Independent School District, at least for some time, or the Houston Independent School District, at least for some time, or the Austin Independent School District, at least for some time, in defiance of the governor's executive order, if they were continuing to require masks, what was the policy? The policy was what was actually being done, not what the policy statement said. That's why this is so important, because sometimes, particularly in our system of government, where you have different governmental officials that make decisions, right? In this case, the governor decides one thing in the form of an executive order, but what's actually being carried out is something else. Okay, good. That's an important point for us to remember. And we also said that sometimes it can be just deliberate deception, right? Government can deliberately, in an effort to deceive, say one thing and then do something else. And I certainly wouldn't want to gloss over that, although I wouldn't want to emphasize it too heavily, because I've discovered that students who come to my classes are already cynical enough about that. We're already predisposed to believe that people in government are always lying to us. And I'm not naive. They do lie sometimes, right? But I wouldn't want you to overstate it. I wouldn't want to overstate it either. There was one other thing, though, that I mentioned to you, and I kind of hinted at it here just a second ago. In addition to, there's also that business about courses of action, right? The longitudinal aspect of policy, the time aspect. Right? Decisions are made at one point in time, but then actions are generally carried out over a period of time. And over time, conditions and circumstances change, and that could lead to changes in what's actually being done. Okay? But there's one other thing that I really sort of, in the primer, I really sort of try to get you to take pretty seriously, and it's about the nature of our system. As I said, I just kind of hinted at it a moment ago. It's this idea of a decentralized system. So that it's very rare, exceedingly rare, for the same actors who make the decisions to also be responsible for carrying out the actions. The usual scenario is one set of actors make the decision, and then another set of governmental actors are responsible for the implementation of the decision. And that can lead things into very different directions. Let me just finish off this list here real quick, because even though it's in the policy primer, okay, what are the other three forms? If you've got legislative statements through statutes, executive through executive orders, what's the third branch of government? Okay, bureaucratic, okay, I was thought you were gonna go somewhere else, but let's go ahead and throw that in. Give me an example. What is your first name, sir?
Mandy.
Okay, can you give us an example of how that, what that might look like? You can use the national level or the state level, whichever you prefer, whatever comes to mind. If you think of like an agency of the federal government, those are usually easier for students to identify. An agency of the federal government that has formal rulemaking authority. Occupational Safety and Health Administration is one of my favorites to use for illustration purposes. The Food and Drug Administration, that's been in the news a lot, right?
CDC.
Centers for Disease Control is actually part of the Health and Human Services Administration. I'm not sure the extent of the rulemaking, the formal rulemaking authority they have. I think they can issue guidance. They're mainly issuing things like guidance rather than formal rules. But like
So do they have authority or just guidance?
well, again, to use the pandemic as an example, the CDC really hasn't issued any formal rules that would require people either to get vaccinated or, in fact, when the Biden administration came up with that initiative to require businesses, this was back last summer, came up with that idea to have businesses that have more than 100 employees to require them to have their employees vaccinated. That was to come in, not in the form of a CDC rule, which you might assume. It was actually to come in the form of an OSHA rule, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So I'm not sure about the CDC. I'm not disputing, that it doesn't have. My inclination say they don't have a whole lot of formal rulemaking authority. Their stuff comes mainly in the form of guidance. Like you should wear a mask. You shouldn't, social distance. You should do this. You should, and then people either take it or leave it. So like when the EPA establishes air quality standards, that comes in the form of a formal rule. Or when the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration passes a rule that says you have to have passive restraints installed in cars that are sold in the United States, that comes in the form of a formal rule. So that would be an example of a type of policy statement, okay? Where when I asked for what was the third branch of government, what I thought I was going to get back were courts. So courts make decisions, and not all decisions of courts constitute policy statements, but many do. But again, like we said here, it's usually somebody else that has to enforce it or implement it. So the example I gave you in the policy primer, I use this as an example in the primer because I think everybody has some frame of reference for that example. The famous Brown versus the Board of Education decision that the court handed down in 1954. By the way, one of the dates that I think Americans should know this. It's kind of like, I'm not real big about having people memorize dates and such. Certainly not really for testing purposes or whatever, but I think there are some dates that we should know just because we're good citizens. July the 4th, 1776. December 7th, 1941. September 11th, 2001. Those are all dates that you probably know and know why they're important. Well, another one that I would add to that list is May 17th, 1954. That's the date that the Supreme Court handed down its decision in that very important case, Brown versus the Board of Education. And there are lots of other cases that are also very important, and I could have used this illustration, but again, as I say, I think this is one that most of you are probably familiar with, at least the basics, right? Because what the court was saying in that case is that the system that we have in many states in this country of segregating school children on the basis of race, one set of schools for whites, another set of schools for blacks, that's a violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, and you can't do that anymore. But if you read that policy primer, again, it may have been something that you were already aware of, but if not, maybe you were learning for the first time. Just because the Supreme Court handed down that decision in 1954 doesn't mean that schools will automatically integrate. Who's got to take the steps to integrate? It's not the 9 justices in the Supreme Court that are going to fan out and, you know, make sure that schools are integrated. Right? Who's going to have to do that?
The state.
State leaders, school leaders at the local school district level, and so on. And in some cases, what did I tell you? In some cases, maybe in a place like Texas, there was some real opposition to that, right? Like official opposition. We're not going to do that in Alabama. Right? We're not going to do that in Texas. We're not going to do that, right? So it didn't happen immediately. In fact, it took decades to get the extent of integration that we have in public elementary and secondary schools today. And some people say that the work's still not done, right? We still haven't finished that job. So that's the importance of understanding that you have to have both decisions and action, right? If certainly, at least for the first 20 years after the court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, if you had said, what's the policy in Arkansas on segregation in public schools, you would have had to say the policy must be to segregate on the basis of race. It's certainly not to integrate. Or in Mississippi or Alabama, like where 99% of African American school children attended schools where the enrollment was entirely African American. Hard to say 20 years after the fact. As late as the early 1970s, that any progress had been made, particularly in the South, on integration at all. All right, questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, well, there were some other characteristics of policy that I went through there, and 5 in total, actually. But, you know, the one that I spent the most time with was that first one, or the most space. I guess it wasn't really so much time as space, but the most verbiage. How's that? Was that discussion of that first one? But you should be familiar with the other 4 characteristics too. Okay. Again, all that's offered in lieu of a definition. All right. Then the next thing here was the systems model. Okay, so who has anybody have any questions about the systems model? So if you were to come in on Tuesday of next week for that first lecture quiz, and you were to see a question that says according to the systems model, the Republican Party is best. I know there was one kind of like this on the reading quiz today, besides, well, that's why I'm using it. Okay, the Republican Party is best described in systems model usage, systems model terminology best described as A, an environment, B, an input structure, C, a government, it's a conversion structure, D, an output, or E, feedback. You would be able to answer that, right? Because you were comfortable with the systems model. Or if I was to say, public policy outputs can generally be conceptualized as either A, benefits, B, deprivations, C, restrictions on behavior, D, A and B, or E, all of the above, something like that. That's, you know, the kind of question that you would be able to answer that, right? So this systems model concept, you know, this is the very simplest version of the systems model. I was going to draw this on here, but well, I'll just leave it up because I'm going to have to jump to reach that now. Years ago, kind of illustrate for you how old I am without me telling you how old I am. Okay. When I was in elementary school, one of the big things that was in vogue in the math curriculum was set theory. Anybody know what I mean by set theory? So they would come in, even at the elementary level, they would say things like, okay, here's the set of A. And now here, inside here, we have all the elements of A. And outside, we have the complement of A. Anything that's not A. Or they might say something like, here's the set of A, here's the set of B, right? Or here's one that I bet you've all seen. Seen Venn diagrams, right? Here's the, if you've ever watched Jimmy Fallon, right? Here's the set of A, here's the set of B, and here's the intersection of A and B. So everybody kind of knows what I'm talking about now, right? Well, so if you go back to this basic idea here, right? What this systems model is suggesting is that here's the set called politics. Political activity, political behavior. And those very well demarcated boundaries suggest that there's something different about what's happening inside here versus what's happening outside of the box. Right? Again, A, not A. Politics, not politics. Now, that don't get so far, right? But even that tells us something. It says that this stuff that we call politics here, something's going on in this political process or this political activity that produces an output. But that those outputs are not produced by the political system or by politics out of a vacuum. They are in response to something called inputs. And they are designed, because they're designed to have an effect, they do on the original conditions and circumstances that gave rise to that activity. So the systems model is an attempt, really it's borrowed from our old friend David Easton, right, who gave us that definition of politics, the authoritative allocation of values, is also the guy who took the systems model, really borrowed it from the engineering sciences, the computer sciences, for example, biological sciences, and applied it to the study of politics. Okay, so some of the verbiage that you see here would have also been used, for example, in the early days of computer science, engineering sciences, again, biological sciences, right? So inputs, system, output, feedback, environment, right? But what he's telling us is that there's something different about this activity called politics, okay? And again, it produces these outputs in response to inputs. It's not just something that's randomly churning out these policy outputs. Well, that's the simplest version of the systems model, and you can see the 5 components here are environment, input, political system, output, and feedback. But this other version of the systems model, a little bit more complicated, a little bit more complex, but there's still the same components there, right? Environment, political system itself, inputs, output, and feedback. But this version of the systems model allows us to differentiate a little bit more, okay? And that's always helpful. So that if we just look at the political system, we can see that there are really different types of political activity. There's the political activity that's occurring in government institutions, and there we're talking about the familiar branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. Not only the institutions, but the actors within those institutions, the processes that they engage in, et cetera. That's one type of politics. And then there's another type of politics that occurs here in these input structures, things like political parties. We all know that political parties and government both have something to do with politics. But I wonder why would we distinguish? If it's both politics, why wouldn't we just call it politics? Why would we distinguish? Right? Well, because the kind of politics or the specific nature of the politics that's occurring within these kinds of institutions is characteristically different than the kinds of politics that's occurring here. Clearly, there's a connection. And then also, if we look at the environment, rather than thinking about the environment in the singular and as some undifferentiated mass called not politics, right, not any other kind of activity that's not politics, instead, we can think about it as systems of variables. There are these different systems of variables out there that affect the operation of whatever political system it is that we have under examination. In this course, the Texas political system. So, does the political culture of Texas have anything to do with the operation of the Texas political system? Of course it does. And that's why early on here in the semester, I think next week, we have a topic on the political culture of Texas. Right? Does the constitutional system have anything to do with the operation of the Texas political system? It does. And that's why we immediately follow that topic on culture with a topic on the Texas Constitution. And, if we had a longer course, time permitting, we could talk about each of these other characteristics as well. But the one that we definitely get to in this course is the external political system. And here we might be talking about mainly the U.S. political system generally. The federal system is really very difficult to understand what happens at the state level, including at the state level here in Texas, unless we understand something about what's happening at the level of the national political system. So all of that, we have a topic in here, again, the first part of the semester, first third of the semester on federalism. Federalism is one of those topics that you can't get enough of. The proof of that is, for those of you who've taken the Government 2305 course, you may remember that there was a topic in that course on federalism. And in the textbook, we have a chapter in our textbook that we're using for this course, chapter 3 on federalism. If you took the 2305 course last semester, you may remember that the textbook that you used had a chapter in there, also chapter 3, on federalism. It's hard to escape federalism in these courses because it's a very important external political system. Okay, we're out of time. We will see you 1 week from today. Don't forget that you have that first lecture quiz, and don't forget that sometime on Thursday afternoon, you'll be getting the second part of this week's curriculum, okay? So maybe later in the day rather than early afternoon.